Hello, friends, and welcome to the Conscious Coffee Break. I'm Jen Kobrick. I'm a holistic family consultant with the Consciously Parenting Project, and today we are talking about trauma and resilience. And the reason we're talking about this is because over the last 9 months to a year, there's been a lot of discussion out there in the world about the events that we're living through being traumatic. And certainly the events that have happened around COVID and in many parts of the world, events with the economy, political events, certainly have the potential to be traumatic events. And I hear pretty frequently from parents that we work with, from families that we work with the Consciously Parenting Project, fears about how these events will impact their children in the long term. And sometimes how these events will impact the adults in the long term as well. And those are certainly valid concerns, and they've been coming up a lot. And so I wanted to address something about how trauma works and about what might be the protective factors and how we and our children might come through this without lasting damage. And one of the things that research is coming to understand about trauma over the last decade or so, and that's becoming more and more clear the more different ways that researchers look at it, is that when a big, overwhelming, potentially traumatic event happens, some people come out of that event with trauma, and some people come out of that event seeming to be more or less okay. And researchers have wondered for a long time what could possibly be the difference between those two groups, between the groups who experience things like post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety, panic attacks as a result of trauma, and people who seem to come through fairly unscathed and go on to live reasonably mentally healthy lives. And one of the things that's becoming really clear is that a big difference between those groups is how much support someone has and how much space there is for integration. And integration is something we talk about a lot in this work, and this is why. So the events that happen that are overwhelming are not always big traumas. They can be, certainly, and the fact that there are so many of those events going on in the world recently is why this has been such a part of the conversation lately. But the events that we find overwhelming can be smaller events as well, and we all experience events that are overwhelming in the moment. So something like being in a car accident, even if it's not a big dramatic car accident, and even if no one is physically hurt, it can still be overwhelming. Something like a separation from a parent can feel overwhelming for a child, even if the separation is not a big or particularly traumatic separation. Something like going to the doctor and getting shots can feel overwhelming to a child. So they don't have to be big events, and certainly don't need to be community-wide or worldwide events to be overwhelming. Things like moving. Moving is often very overwhelming in the moment because things tend to move very fast and not always predictably, and not always with a lot of ability to plan or predict or know what to expect. So all of those kinds of things are things that happen in our lives and are a normal part of life that can be big and overwhelming relative to other events without needing to be, the kinds of capital T trauma that tend to get written about in news stories. So when we make space, let's start with what happens when we don't make space. When we don't make space to process those events later, because the definition of an overwhelming event is that it's too much to process in the moment. There's not enough time to feel all of the feelings and understand all of the pieces and work through everything as it's happening. And as I said, everyone has experiences like that. There is nothing wrong with having an experience that is a bit more than you can process in that moment. And if we don't make the space later to come back and process those things, then we tend to get stuck there. Then we tend to have the kinds of symptoms that at an extreme version can look like PTSD, but even on a smaller scale can be things like every time if a child has had a separation from a parent that they haven't fully processed, then every time the parent leaves the room, it can trigger their nervous system to remember what that felt like and to go there into that place of feeling overwhelmed and unable to process. Even if the parent has just stepped into the bathroom and is coming back in 2 minutes. And it can feel really big and out of proportion because it is out of proportion to that moment, because what it's doing is making the nervous system remember this other overwhelming moment. And so we do this as parents when we get triggered. We have a big reaction that is out of proportion to what's happening in the moment. When we are being reminded, our nervous system is being reminded of some other big, difficult thing that we have not fully processed and integrated. And so when we're experiencing events like quarantine, severe social isolation, economic hardship, when we're experiencing these events that are happening in the world and they're happening to a lot of people, it's natural that we're going to feel overwhelmed. And if we don't come back and make the space to tell those stories, to process those feelings, to integrate that experience, then we can get stuck in those feelings again, and we may see patterns come up later down the road of things like people who don't manage to integrate these things may, for example, spend the rest of their life always having a year's worth of toilet paper on hand, as a small example. Or we may see people, become very clingy and reactive if they are ever not with other people. So we may see those things come out over time as we, as a group, as a society, move out of this time. But if we do make time to process and slow down and allow the process of integration, and what integration means is that we are taking the physical sensations and the feelings and how those show up in our bodies and making space for those and connecting them with the narrative story. And so we often, we rehash the narrative story, the telling of this is what happened, and saying it with words, but without making space for what's going on in our bodies and our emotions. And that can actually be re-traumatizing. That is bringing back the memories and re-engaging the nervous system, but without giving the nervous system any kind of different pathway. So it's just reinforcing the same pathway of overwhelm, of fight or flight or freeze, of feeling stuck and unable to move anywhere with that energy. So when we do this piece of slowing down the narrative story and making room to feel and process and put the body sensations together with the story, and there's a process for this. And if you're interested in learning more, there's a course on the Consciously Parenting website specifically about healing stories and how this process looks and all of the steps. And as we go through that process and we connect the story and the nervous system and the body, and we bring all those pieces together, then we give the nervous system a new pathway. We give the nervous system a new understanding of that was an event, and that is not something that needs to come back every time a shadow of that event comes up in our lives. we give the nervous system space to settle and to recognize that it did its job keeping us safe during an overwhelming circumstance, and that circumstance doesn't need to be a continuous state of our mind and our body. And so the research is finding that people who have had the support, and this is something that requires support, not something that can be done in isolation, which is why the type of support and group interaction that we do is so important to this, because we all need that space of community and of being heard and being together with people in order to do this processing. So the research is finding that people who have support like that and have the ability to process and integrate traumatic events come out of those events with less symptoms of trauma than people who don't have the opportunity to process and integrate. So there's no deadline for integration. Certainly people work through things that happened many, many, many years ago. It is in some ways easier the sooner it's done, because the nervous system is less ingrained in that pathway, so it's less of a shift to get out of it. But there isn't a deadline. There's no time at which it's too late to integrate trauma. So I hope that in hearing this, what you take away is that we cannot change that there have been a lot of difficult things that have happened and overwhelming things that have happened in the world over the past 9 months to a year. But we can do the piece where we come together in community and we support each other and we make space for that integration for ourselves, so that we can then hold that space for our children, so that our children can come out of it with this integrated understanding of this experience, rather than fear and isolation and trauma. So if you have questions about any of that or comments, please feel free to share them in the comments or send us a message. And of course, if you do not have all of the support that you need to be able to integrate the experiences of the past year, then please reach out. We have free healing story circles a couple of times a month. Those are group calls. We have a membership that will be reopening for new members soon, and you can get that information anytime. And we always have one-on-one support as well available to you. All right, so have a great week, and I will see you next week again on the coffee break.